Hey everyone, welcome to the CSA webinar series Cloud Bytes. I'm Bryan Solari, your moderator today. And today we're going to hear from security experts Chris Hughes from Acquia and Tim Bach from App Omni, who are going to share some tips on how to develop, launch, and maintain your SaaS security program, which is a topic of interest for many organizations these days. As we dig into these different tips, keep in mind that you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about the pertinent interests to your organization as you consider the topic of building a SaaS security program and have questions pertaining to the realm of SaaS security. So we'll look forward to answering your questions. From the panelists today, I'd love to just get a quick intro, starting with Chris Hughes, the CISO at Acquia. Chris, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, Chris Hughes here, co-founder and CISO at Acquia. We work in the public sector, focused on cybersecurity. We're actually leading a SaaS security and governance program for a large federal agency. But outside of that, I've been in the cyberspace for almost 20 years, within the DoD, the public sector, and commercial industry as well. Super active, in the cloud security space, obviously here with Cloud Security Alliance, and really excited to be here today.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Chris. I find it hard to believe that people wouldn't know who you are these days. You're all over LinkedIn. It's awesome to see you here and have you as a guest. Tim, love to get an intro from you as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. My name is Tim Bach. I am currently the VP of Engineering at App Omni. We are a cybersecurity company that focuses specifically on SaaS security management. So I've spent the last about 3.5 years working on building out that function and kind of helping to build a platform for SaaS security that is unlike anything that's out there available today. I come from a background as a security practitioner at large companies. I spent a long time at Salesforce leading their security engineering team, and that really drives a lot of what we build at App Omni. It's the SaaS security management tool that we wish we had when we were doing that job for large companies.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I think one thing I really want to drive home for our viewers and listeners today is really just give them an understanding of why SaaS is important. I think all three of us have seen SaaS security come from an emerging place into this burgeoning space that organizations are eager to hear more about, to understand how they can mitigate threats and really understand what they can do to be proactive about the SaaS applications that their organizations are really acquiring. How they can secure those assets going forward. I think where we'd start is just kind of going through the shared responsibility model of SaaS assets and SaaS applications. I hear from clients a lot and potential customers of mine. They're trying to understand the difference between cloud and SaaS. It seems like SaaS fits into cloud, and so from a sector standpoint, but there's some unique differentiators about SaaS. I'm curious, Tim, maybe if you could just cover some of those unique differentiators and get some insight from Chris as well.
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest differentiators and one of the most obvious ones is SaaS applications. You as a security team, you don't have the ability to install anything on the metal. So when we're talking about infrastructure as a service or anything that's on-prem, if you're running bare metal, you have total control. And so obviously you have more responsibility, more things to think about, but that also gives you some flexibility. If you want to monitor all traffic into or out of the system, you have the ability to install an agent to monitor traffic. You control the network routing to the service. So you have a lot more areas where you can kind of insert control points. With SaaS, you lose all of that. And you don't lose it for nothing. I mean, there's a lot of value to having a SaaS provider fully manage a lot more of the shared responsibility model. But I think it's something that most organizations don't think about. I think it's also partially due to the fact that SaaS providers have done an exceptionally good job with managing a lot of this for us. And so we get lulled into this sense of security where you just kind of assume that something is in SaaS, therefore it is secure. You've kind of checked that box. And what I see is a lot of security organizations not really thinking deeply about the parts of the shared responsibility model that they're responsible for when it comes to managing SaaS applications, because it just has not been traditionally in their portfolio or one of their major security programs. Once they start thinking about that and start to do an assessment, I think that they find that they can manage it very similarly to other types of cloud technology that they're using. They do need purpose-built technology for SaaS security, just like they need purpose-built technology for infrastructure security, endpoint security, or any other of the major program verticals that security leaders work towards. But I think it's just a recognition that there is a difference in how we have to manage SaaS security and where the delineation between provider and customer is in the shared responsibility model.
Chris, I'm curious to hear your perspective. You have a little bit of a unique angle, given that you're predominantly helping government organizations, from my understanding. I mean, is it do you have similar perspectives, or is there anything unique about your client base and the organizations that you help that you think are worth mentioning around SaaS security?
Well, there's definitely some unique aspects, but I think what Tim called out is a lot of the nuanced, technical perspectives that are relevant there when it comes to responsibilities, when it comes to consuming cloud. And, when you let in with the question of what's the difference between cloud and SaaS, and I think that's part of the problem is that, SaaS is cloud. It's just another delivery model for cloud. And people get lulled into that sense of security when it comes to cloud in general, that the cloud provider is doing everything. And in SaaS, yes, they are doing much more for you than in traditional, PaaS or IaaS environments, but you still have responsibility, as you see on the slide here, for applications, identity access management, data, things of that nature, regulatory and compliance requirements. I think that's often overlooked. Another thing that I think is, when we talk about cloud security, it's always in the context of IaaS, right? The latest big bucket exposure or database, vulnerability that lets a tenant break out or something, right? But organizations may be consuming 2 to 3 IaaS providers where they're consuming tens to hundreds of SaaS providers, and they really have no rigor or governance around this. And it's something that organizations need to start thinking about because it's a big part of your enterprise, portfolio of applications and usage that you need to start getting some coverage and security hygiene around to really improve your security posture. And I think that's part of the problem. And also, one last note, just from a learning perspective, as you see in the last thing on there where it says uncommon, each SaaS app is different. When it comes to learning, for example, there's clear learning paths for AWS and Azure and Google Cloud, for example. But SaaS is much more diverse. There's not necessarily a clear learning path for every SaaS app, and there's no way every one individual can learn all SaaS apps. So that presents a unique challenge for security professionals too.
Yeah, 100%. I feel you there. I think Tim probably agrees. We see organizations that are deployed now, Workday, G Suite, Salesforce, and each of these different apps has a different threat model. And so you're trying to constantly chase these different settings and these different risks that are very unique to these individual apps. It's very hard to hire for as well. I think, like you said, with AWS, GCP, Azure, there's some commonalities across these different cloud architectures, and the people can go and get certified in these different architectures. There's kind of a golden path to becoming an expert in those spaces. I think with SaaS, it's almost like finding a unicorn to try to hire someone with all this different experience. Tim, anything else you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that when we bring up and kind of the answer to this question, infrastructure as a service, like IaaS platforms, that we've been talking about these for a long time, because it really, in my view, it's very much a parallel. So you think back to when we were shifting from major organizations managing their own metal to moving to infrastructure in the cloud. There was the same sort of conversation of moving to IaaS platforms and then starting to understand the unique security challenges that come with IaaS compared to managing your own metal. The recognition that you need specific technology to monitor for that. Like Chris mentioned, the open bucket challenge. Open buckets were not a thing when we were managing our own data centers or when we were running our own metal. That is a unique challenge to IaaS clouds. And that's something that we saw develop in the security industry and an understanding of that develop over the past, a decade or so. I think SaaS is on the same trajectory right now. We've seen a huge move to SaaS, and it was only accelerated by the pandemic over the last 2.5 years. And now we as security practitioners need to start to evolve our threat models and need to evolve our technology stacks to make sure that we are addressing the challenges that are unique to SaaS and follow the same kind of learnings we did as we migrated to cloud before this.
Yeah, I was going to add just real quick, if I could. I think what Tim points out is I've seen SaaS essentially become the linchpin of the distributed workforce in many ways. And I think that emphasizes why we need to really paying attention to the security of our SaaS environments, because we have this distributed workforce with SaaS being so ubiquitous to facilitate that. So if we're not paying attention, it can have a consequence that could be devastating.
Yeah, I know we're going to dig into some of the most important tips to get started with SaaS security and develop your program. But I'm curious if you see, a common risk area or a common thing that customers of SaaS platforms maybe aren't aware of, and they get kind of caught or they're surprised. Any specifics around, settings or configurations or issues that you see across a wide number of customers that maybe our listeners should be aware of, just going into this set of tips?
You want to go ahead, Tim, or I'll jump in? I guess I'll jump in real
go
quick.
Ahead, Chris.
Yeah, some of the common things I definitely see is, when it comes to identity, you tend to have an identity sprawl situation. You kind of have these siloed identity stores in each SaaS app where they're not implementing federation, an SSO across the enterprise. And someone may move on to another organization or something like that, but they still have access to that environment and to the data that's in that environment. That's one major issue I see. And also, I think there's not enough due diligence around the SaaS vendor themselves in terms of, where are they hosted? Where's your data reside? Where are there restrictions around, access to that data within those data centers or cloud providers, for example, where they may be hosting their SaaS app. That's a lot of things I see that people don't pay enough attention to. And another unique thing that we're starting to see is the push for SBOM, right? The same concept applies when it comes to SaaS vendors. What's in that software that you're consuming from the SaaS vendor? Can they provide you a BOM detailing that, for example, so what software components are in there, and if something does come out like a Log4j, or something similar, are you impacted by that? Is your SaaS footprint going to be impacted in your workloads that you have there in data, for example? So those are key things to keep in mind, I think, for folks moving forward.
Yeah. I would add to what Chris said, specifically in that understanding of an inventory. It seems like everything about security, we go back to we need an asset inventory, because you can't secure what you don't know about. And SaaS absolutely sprawls across a large enterprise. There's been Gartner studies showing that most mid-size and larger businesses are using 50 plus different SaaS applications. How many does the security team know about? Right. So we certainly need some sort of ability to inventory and understand what SaaS platforms we're trying to secure as a security organization. And then, as we were talking about earlier, that will then introduce training challenges. You need a lot of resources to secure 50 plus different applications if you're trying to assign individuals to think about it. But the main thing, I would kind of call out, in addition to what Chris already did, is I see a lot of customers building SaaS security programs. And for them, it's deploying, or as they're deploying kind of this new program that they haven't thought about, they're realizing that a lot of these platforms have no safe default, so to speak, with regards to external users. So when I talk about external users, I'm talking about non-corporate identities, so non-privileged users. The stereotypical example might be running a customer support portal out of a SaaS platform. So that your end customers, not the direct SaaS customers, but your actual customers as a large organization, can file tickets or support requests. Most SaaS platforms will see these external identities as users like any other. And these SaaS platforms are basically cloud operating systems. They're going to faithfully perform whatever configuration you have programmed them with. So it becomes very easy for a SaaS administrator to inadvertently expose too much data to these external users. And again, as far as the SaaS platform is concerned, they're just users. The SaaS platform is not designed to understand, this user, which is a user account, should, by default not have any sort of access. That's up to the end user, the SaaS customer, to put into place. So, unfortunately for me, this has not been theoretical. We've worked with a lot of large companies that have had to put monitoring in place around this. So to me, and kind of to harken back to what we were just talking about, this is the SaaS example of an open bucket. It's something that you have configured in such a way that it could create a data leak. It is not the fault of the provider, just like open S3 buckets are not the fault of Amazon. And it is creating real data leaks for users of large SaaS applications. So, you combine that with the ability to make rapid changes in SaaS applications. And I think this is where people really need to focus in on adding continuous monitoring to understand if that data is being exposed and if it's changing, if it happens very quickly with a configuration change, being able to quickly roll that back and quickly understand who has access to that data, especially for non-corporate identities.
Thanks, Tim. I think, as we dig into these 5 SaaS security tips to get started with your SaaS security program and develop and maintain it, I think what we're all talking about is how do you make this easier, right? How do you make this parsimonious? Are there easy tips to get started with setting your requirements? And I think, Tim, you probably have a good vantage on that. I'd love to hear from you. what are some easy ways that customers can develop their requirements around SaaS security to really manage what is important to them?
Yeah, well, I think kind of like we were just saying, the first step really does have to be getting an inventory of your SaaS applications. Understand where SaaS is being used across the business that you're securing or the organization that you're securing. But once you've done that, I think it's important to start to understand industry best practices, not try and go it alone. So using resources like the CSA, and using resources like published frameworks, whether it's a compliance framework or a security framework, to understand what are the best practices going to be for the SaaS applications that you're using, and then conducting, a stereotypical gap analysis. Where are you today, and where do you want to go? So as you're developing those requirements, I think it's really important to keep in mind that we cannot treat SaaS security like a point-in-time exercise, just like we can't do that for infrastructure security, endpoint monitoring, or any other program that we put into place to secure sensitive data across an organization. So as you're building these requirements, I would say resist the urge to build a checklist, validate that it's in place, make changes to get to that known or expected good state, and then put it back on the shelf for a year. I think one of the unique challenges of SaaS, especially as compared to infrastructure, is that it is very easy for non-security users to make security impacting changes. If you think about Microsoft 365 or Workday or Google Workspace, if you are an administrator or a highly privileged user, it can be as simple as unchecking a single checkbox inadvertently to create the potential for a very large data leak. So when you think about that, and that kind of rapid change that is what SaaS is known for and what it's great for, you really have to be then building a security program that monitors these requirements continuously. And that's something I think it's really important to take into account really when you're first setting out on this SaaS security journey, to identify as one of the requirements for what you're going to build.
Chris, are you seeing anything unique about your space with the way that clients develop best practices? How are you advising them where to start?
Yeah, definitely. I think I loved a lot of the points that Tim brought up, but I will call out a couple things. Inventorying SaaS apps sounds, straightforward, on the surface, but it's definitely not. Some studies are showing that, IT, for example, the IT office and shop or cybersecurity shop, for example, is only controlling, roughly 25% of SaaS usage across the enterprise. And so it's really hard to get inventory when you have this, simple, throw a credit card number in and you can be using it right away kind of scenario. So people are trying to chase things down manually, which is okay, but it's not efficient. You need a technical measure. There's things like CASBs and other measures you can use to try to get some inventory in place. And then as far as your adoption and usage processes go, in the federal sector, I can tell you, obviously everyone in the federal sector is familiar with FedRAMP. So many organizations look to FedRAMP when it comes to adopting SaaS. But that said, FedRAMP has been around for a decade and it has, 240 approved SaaS services among, thousands within the marketplace, for example. So there's a lot of unauthorized, non-FedRAMP approved SaaS services being used that you still need to account for and secure. And that's something I see people starting to take a look at now. And then as far as requirements and best practices, obviously, like Tim said, looking to things like FedRAMP, for example, is great. Another thing you should be looking for is, knowing that you don't know all these SaaS apps so well, look to things that may exist as far as CIS benchmarks or other guidance even from the vendor, obviously, and vendor best practices that could be implemented to secure these environments. And then I definitely agree with his point around continuous monitoring. These environments, the configurations are constantly changing. As he said, you may have an IaaS environment that changes. Maybe you have a rigorous control and configuration management practice around that. But for SaaS, that's not the case. Now imagine that across tens to hundreds of apps, constantly changing. You cannot manually track that. You have to have an automated continuous monitoring, technical measure in place in order to get any kind of rigor and control around that scenario.
Chris, I've read a bunch of your LinkedIn posts around SBOM and also inventory methodologies. Can you talk a bit about, the third step here, like inventorying all your SaaS apps? What are ways that you can do that, and why is that important?
Well, it goes back to what we were saying, in terms of like inventory has always been a critical control, the SANS, SANS critical control, CIS, critical top 20 or 18 or whatever it is at the moment. Inventory has always been a critical control, and inventory of software is right up there on the top of the list. And SaaS is software, right? So you need to have an inventory of that. You can't protect it. You can't see what data is there, who has access to it. None of those things can be done until you know what's being used. As far as, getting a handle on it, there's a lot of innovative things you can do in terms of, like I said, CASBs, for example, but those can implement, or introduce a bottleneck for many environments, and people are afraid of that. There's also new providers coming out with, whether it's a browser-based plugin or it links into your financial accounting systems and sees, your spend and can try to track it that way. So there's a lot of promising things underway to try to get a handle on what's being used within an organization. And that's kind of the first step that, before you can do a lot of these things, you need to at least know what's being used. And then, going back to step two, okay, now we know what's being used. What's going to be our process moving forward? How do we vet these new providers? What are our compliance and regulatory requirements that are going to drive our usage of a SaaS provider? It's kind of a broader part of it's part of a broader, supply chain conversation. For example, a SaaS provider is basically a broader extension of your supply chain, and you need to address it in the, leading into those practices. If you look at NIST guidance, for example, around cybersecurity supply chain, that's a great place to start when it comes to external vendors.
100%. Yeah, the number of SaaS applications we're seeing in environments is incredible. Just the number, and also the variety and different types of data that they're storing, processing, transmitting. Yeah. It really is an incredible time of SaaS growth at most organizations.
Another quick comment, what I've seen too is it's not uncommon to have duplicative SaaS usage, not even just variety, but you can have 7, 8 instances of the same exact SaaS provider in a large organization with many different business units consuming it, and no one knows that it exists, 7 times. I mean, what's the configuration and security across those 7 different environments? And when it comes to identity and data, it's a sprawling problem.
It really is. It's really interesting to see that. SaaS has been incredibly effective at the land and expand sales model. And so instead of, when you think about more traditional, even cloud usage, but more traditional technology usage, you're selling to the office of the CIO or the IT team. You're trying to sell for an enterprise deployment and get, Acme Corporation to adopt your product across the board. SaaS has successfully gone the opposite way of saying, oh, well, I'll get this one organization to install Slack, and they'll love it so much that other people across the company will also want their executive to buy Slack for that organization. And then exactly what Chris said, the security team might find out about usage of this app because someone on their team wants to use it themselves. And that's when they start to do an assessment of where is this, and find out they have 7, 10, 15, 25 instances of a SaaS app deployed separately, billed separately, managed separately across the organization. And so that's where it becomes really challenging from a security perspective. A lot of times we go into very large corporations where security does not even have a login to critical SaaS applications that are storing incredibly sensitive, compliance relevant or business integrity relevant data. And that's where having a solution that you can deploy that almost mediates that relationship between security and the line of business using the SaaS application is really important. As Bryan and Chris both mentioned earlier, it's going to be very, very challenging to hire enough security talent in a security talent shortage to manually maintain top of the line knowledge of all these SaaS applications, their security settings, and the fact that they're releasing new security relevant features and settings monthly or quarterly. It becomes a very challenging thing to manage from a manual point of view, or have enough security talent to do it. And so that's where building this program using industry best practices, shared frameworks, or vendors that will come with kind of amortizing that out of the box knowledge just becomes super critical for security practitioners.
Tim, I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. You've determined your requirements, best practices. You've created your adoption and usage processes. Now you've got your inventory of your different SaaS applications that are critical to your organization. Can you walk me through that 4-step of conducting the baseline review and then performing remediation? What are you looking for? What's the process here? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, well, I think that just like recognizing asset inventory has been important in every other security program you've built, conducting that first review and remediation is also going to be pretty similar to how a lot of security organizations have thought about security for application security, endpoint security, enterprise security, anything like that. It's a very similar process, just a different flavor. You want to design essentially a policy of your known good state. And so that's where you're going to spend that time researching or working with kind of frameworks and vendors or industry best practices. You're going to basically be building the state that you expect your SaaS deployments to be in. And then you want to evaluate the current state of those SaaS deployments against it. This is where it can get very challenging and time consuming to do things manually, because SaaS applications, they're large, they're complex. The settings are kind of all over the place in terms of where you're going to find security relevant settings. Some of them will be in a central control panel. Some of them will be individual user settings or role settings or group settings. So there is a layer of complexity there where automation can really help you. But at the end of the day, what you want to basically get to is an analysis of current state versus expected state. Where are those deltas? How do I make those changes? One thing I will call out, when we as security practitioners are looking at a new realm for us to cover, essentially looking at a dark room for the first time and trying to make sure that we can get a handle on things, we certainly are incentivized to use automation and technology that's going to help us. And I would say be very careful about the level of access that you are granting technology to help automate some of this. Make sure you are not introducing new risks. Like Chris said, understand the SBOM, understand kind of the supply chain that you're introducing here. You really don't want to introduce a new risk in the pursuit of closing existing risks. I've seen in past lives working with security products that, because it was the easiest thing to do, they requested kind of top tier admin level permissions in order to monitor and try and resolve things. If I'm granting a third party admin level permissions, I have created a significant new potential source of vulnerability in my SaaS deployments or my infrastructure deployments, my endpoint deployments. So make sure that you are conducting a lot of due diligence and kind of review of the technology you're going to deploy to solve this issue, so that you don't solve SaaS security issues for the platforms you have today by introducing a new SaaS security issue. So that's one thing I think about a lot when we're deploying technology to do this remediation. Let's make sure that we're, as practitioners, kind of not feeling desperate and reaching out to solutions that aren't secure, or building something ourselves that will introduce new problems.
Chris, are there ways that your clients or organizations that you've seen in the field can make remediation easier, can put these findings into context? Are there any standards that you see on a regular basis that can be helpful with these baseline reviews and then processing the results?
Yeah, I think Tim was spot on in terms of leaning into, like, obviously industry best practices. Like, depending on the size of the SaaS provider, say if you're talking a Salesforce, there's going to be guidance like a CIS benchmark or something out there that you can leverage, right? But there's so many SaaS apps that they don't exist for every SaaS app. You may have to lean into the industry best practices, from a security perspective, just, proper cybersecurity hygiene that you would implement in general application security practices like you talked about, or looking to the vendor to get best practices from them on how you can secure your footprint of usage of a certain SaaS app. And I also like what he was referring to as far as the supply chain goes. In that regard, yes, your users are reaching out and using these SaaS apps, but it's not necessarily only a one-way door. There's an ability for, if the SaaS app is compromised, for them to, maliciously come into your environment and wreak havoc and, introduce risk to you as well. So you need to keep that in mind, from an incident response, perspective as well. It's just understanding that, they can also introduce risk to you, not only within the app itself, but if there's permissions and access and whatnot, network traffic, et cetera, going back and forth between the SaaS app, that can be another conduit of risk to your organization. So those are all great things to keep in mind.
Well, maybe speak to me a little bit about step 5. So, like, leveraging automation, right? We see, automation is amazing in different sectors. Sometimes it introduces challenges, but more often than not, it introduces efficiencies over time. What's your impression of why automation or leveraging technology is important in this space? How are you seeing companies do this now, or organizations try to handle SaaS security now? How can automation help here?
Yeah, I think it's not like, how can it help? It's like it has to help. We talked about this earlier in the conversation. And I kind of missed this in your previous question, so I do apologize. But, as far as we talked about the diverse landscape of SaaS, there's no way one organization, one group of security professionals are going to know all the various settings within a SaaS provider. But if you look at technologies like SSPMs, SaaS security posture management, technologies, for example, such as AppOmni and others, you can look to vendors like you guys, SSPM providers who have have a broad reach and experience with many different SaaS providers. That's where they can go out and have, those best practices, they've seen this across not just one client in one environment, but many environments. And that lets them bring those best practices to you, in your team, because you can't expect your internal team to know all these apps that well. But an organization like an SSPM who focuses on this space, they can bring that to bear for you and your organization. And then by implementing those SSPM tools, you can get that going across your SaaS footprint and start to implement, like you said, automation to see, how are we looking from a vulnerability perspective? How are we looking from just a configuration management and best practices perspective? And then also there's the compliance aspect, scanning your SaaS footprint for compliance requirements, whether it's NIST, or FedRAMP or HIPAA, whatever industry and regulatory requirements you have. Using those tools can really help you bring to bear that expertise that you don't have internally in many cases.
Tim, anything to add there?
Yeah, I could not agree more with what Chris is saying. And to kind of double down on that last piece on why automation is so helpful across the scale of SaaS applications. When I started my career in security, I did a lot more application security and penetration testing. And what drew me into security engineering and why I love this particular part of the security industry so much is because it's all about getting computers to do what computers are good at, so that the security engineers, the professionals that you are paying to think about things at a high level, can focus on the challenging problems. When I was doing security engineering at Salesforce, it was, if I can build technology that improves the efficiency or takes 20% of the rote workload off of your security engineers, and you scale that across a team of 20, I basically hired several security engineers without having to go find them in this talent shortage. And that's what SaaS security management, SSPM tools are good for. You could certainly task a large team of security professionals with logging into every one of your SaaS applications, looking at your expected benchmarks and going, finding those settings in the application, verifying that, they are correct, logging that in an Excel sheet, sending it to your auditors or your security teams. Like, that's totally possible. No one is saying that like SaaS security management tooling has access that humans do not, but that's just not a good use of your professionals' time. So SaaS security management solutions can go in and automate those checks multiple times a day across all of your SaaS deployments, across all of the different SaaS clouds that you have, and tell you where to spend your time. So instead of you doing those thousands of manual checks, a SSPM solution will do it for you and tell you exactly what you need to go investigate, what you need to go understand and potentially fix. And it can do it faster than humans can. So that's one of those things where this is exactly what security engineering should be building. Computers are better at this job, and then let the humans think about the output. The one other thing I'll say about that, I'm sure everyone on this call, we've all been working in the security industry. You've all been sold a new single pane of glass at least 5 or 6 times a year. I think when I was at Salesforce, I had like 17 single panes of glass, right? So don't fall for that is what I would say. Like, find a solution that works with the technology stacks you have. I'm sure large organizations, you certainly have a large security operations team, you have an established process. Find a SaaS security management solution that will insert the findings in that process. Whether you want a ticket automatically filed against the IT team that manages Workday, log it automatically in ServiceNow or Jira or whatever you're using. If you're having monitoring and detection findings, have those sent to Splunk or Sumo or whatever operations center technology you're already using. Don't expect your security team to learn another piece of automation to log into. Make sure you're finding something that integrates with the process you already have.
Fair to say burnout prevention. Is that pretty fair to say?
Yeah.
Let's go on to some questions. Thank you guys. Really, I appreciate you sharing your expertise with folks on this call. I know a few questions came in while we've been talking, so I wanted to go through them. One that I saw that I thought would be really, really good to talk about is, how do you decide where to start? Like, which apps do you select first when you're thinking about where to start your SaaS security journey?
You want to go ahead? I'll just jump in.
Go ahead, Chris.
I'll jump in. So the way I've typically approached it is, it's kind of like everything with risk management. You want to look at where's your most sensitive data. When it comes to using SaaS providers, right? Are you putting sensitive data in a certain SaaS provider or a group of SaaS providers? Those are going to be ones that you obviously prioritize. And then obviously it comes down to usage too. Like I talked about, I have some organizations that are using 7, 8 instances of the same SaaS app, and they are using it, in many places across the organization. That's a very logical place to start. So you want to start with the SaaS apps that have the most sensitive data, that has the biggest footprint within the organization. And then obviously they're the most mature in the industry as well, because then you can lean into the things that we talked about whether it's SSPM tooling, to do scanning and compliance scanning, et cetera, and also CIS benchmarks and industry guidance. These more mature SaaS apps have those things available, so you can speed up that process of securing your SaaS footprint. Where get to some of the more nuanced SaaS providers, you may not have as much guidance, benchmarks to lean into, and it's going to be a lot more legwork associated with those.
Tim, I saw another question too. That's a great answer, Chris. I 100% agree. One thing that I think companies that I speak with or organizations I speak with struggle with is like, who should handle this stuff? I think, Tim, you and I have talked with countless organizations about, which team should handle this. It's kind of like it's like both different teams are going to catch the ball, and there's a chance that ball could just drop to the ground. So like, Tim, who should be handling this inside of organizations? Which teams should handle SaaS security?
Yeah. I view the best model, and this is just my opinion. There are obviously multiple options out there, but in my opinion, the best model goes back to the same one that security organizations are used to using for the application security, the process that they use for application security. So when you think about the most common application security model, you don't have your security team actually fixing the code. You find the vulnerability, you find the potential security issue, and you collaborate with the engineering team to fix the issue. And that's the model I suggest for SaaS security. And specifically, one of the ways that I suggest using SaaS security management tools is to kind of create that nexus. You already have teams managing your deployments of Workday, Salesforce, Slack, Microsoft 365, whatever SaaS platform it is. It's not like it hasn't been managed in the past. Someone has admin keys to it. Someone is taking care of adding users, et cetera. Work with them. So I know that in the security industry, unfortunately, there are antagonistic relationships between security teams and their internal customers. And so that's where we try and help teams build a workflow that security did not have a login to the SaaS application before. Okay, let's get them a login. Let's get it connected to a SaaS security management tool. Let's let the security team use their expertise to define policies around multi-factor authentication, around identity management, around data access. Then let's use the automation to continuously monitor that. And when we find issues, let's be able to put together a ticket with remediation guidance and explanations of why these things have to change, and send it to the team that has been managing SaaS successfully in many cases for multiple years, where the SaaS deployment has already existed. This is important, one, because we don't have enough talent in the security community right now to be individually managing every SaaS deployment at every major company. That's just not going to scale. But it also is allowing security teams to do what they're good at defining and monitoring the proper configuration of data access in SaaS applications, and then allowing the lines of businesses that are managing these applications to do what they're good at. And hopefully also creating a little bit more understanding on both sides of the fence of how SaaS is used, why it's important, and what the good known best practices for configuration are.
Chris, is there a unique setup in the government space as well, or with organizations that you advise?
It's actually very similar to the way that we approach it, and I think what Tim is hinting at is that security doesn't necessarily own the risk. We're there to advise the business units of how securely you should be, or how you should be securely configuring and using these SaaS applications. But ultimately, the business unit is the one that's using these apps on a day-to-day basis to support their missions, their system owners, their customers, et cetera. So security can be there to monitor, advise, give recommendations, but ultimately those business units are the ones that are going to own that risk. And I think putting the security team in a position to just be there to give that advice, give that insight and recommendation, but letting the business team ultimately make the risk-informed decision is really going to be the key to success.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate your time coming on today, talking with us about SaaS security. One thing I wanted to make sure we talk about, Chris, you've been working super hard with Tim on the forthcoming report, SaaS Governance Best Practices for Cloud Customers. Can you talk a bit about the paper that's going to be released here soon?
Yeah, definitely. We've had a really great group of diverse contributors from across the globe. Many different industries that have jumped in and contributed. And I couldn't even rattle off the sections of the white paper. I'm reluctant to even call it a white paper. It's turning into like an ebook almost. But I haven't seen anything as comprehensive as this. When it comes to SaaS security best practices and governance. So we're looking to have this published mid-March roughly, and I think it's gonna be a great resource for the community when it comes to getting a handle on SaaS and SaaS governance.
Excellent. Yeah, it's been a culmination of just so many different people's perspectives and experiences and expertise in SaaS It's cool to watch it come together. I'm super excited for that to come out. So, well, thank you guys. I appreciate your time today. It's been a pleasure. I'm assuming there's a good way to reach out to both of you. Chris, is that on LinkedIn? Is that the best way to reach you?
Yeah, I kind of live there most of the day, so you can usually find me on LinkedIn.
Tim, same for you.
LinkedIn's great.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate having you on. Take care. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. You too.
Take care. Bye-bye.